My name is Jim Peyser, and the reason I'm here, other than moderating this panel, is that I'm a member of the Practitioners Council. I'm also the former Secretary of Education in Massachusetts and former chair of the State Board of Education as well. And I'm joined here by Jeremy Tucker, who is the Superintendent of Schools, the Liberty Public Schools in Kansas. I guess it's, how far outside of Kansas City?
Kansas City on the Missouri side.
On the Missouri side, yes.
I got to clarify.
Good point.
That. Yeah.
Very
Home of
good
the
point.
Chiefs, by the way.
Oh, there we go. Liberty is home of the Chiefs?
Well, Kansas City, Missouri.
Oh, okay.
Missouri
Well, that I know.
is.
I knew
Missouri
that.
is.
And Philip Howard, who is an author and attorney who wrote a book years ago, I don't know how many, maybe 30 years ago, on the death of common sense, which is was sort of a watershed moment, which has led to more books and more publishing on his part, but I think provocative part of the public policy dialogue, including in particular the one that we're having here today about the role of government and governance in public education, and in particular its relationship to the autonomy and accountability in our public schools. This particular session is really focused on one of the central recommendations coming out of the Council's report, which is flipping the system, or reversing the traditional hierarchy of our public education system, whereby state governments and district central offices establish detailed rules and regulations, issue prescriptive mandates that the schools are then expected to faithfully implement. And the Council's recommendations are to flip that basic design or structure in such a way as to empower school leadership and school leadership teams to make decisions, and assigning the higher level sort of governance agencies the job of providing resources and support while maintaining and measuring baseline standards. In other words, moving from a unitary school system to a system of distinctive and autonomous and accountable schools. And in many respects, I think, as the report indicates, building on some of the lessons coming out of the charter sector, and particularly the gap-busting schools that Mackie made reference to earlier today. And the basic premise behind all this, of course, is that one size doesn't fit all, and that effective practice and, importantly, organizational change requires real agency and ownership on the part of the frontline educators and leaders who are actually doing the work with real children and real families and real communities. And that, therefore, schools should be primarily responsible, or held primarily responsible, for student outcomes rather than bureaucratic compliance. So that's the big idea, and I know you've all heard about that through the course of the day, and that's certainly central to the Council's findings in the report. But as with any idea, it's easier said than done, which is what we're here today to discuss in this particular panel, trying to understand what a flipped system would actually look like, and how we would get from where we are to where we might want to be, and doing so in a way that is balancing this imperative for autonomy with a similar imperative for accountability for results. So with that, Phil, let me turn it over to you first to give us some sort of higher level framing, if you will, for this idea about why it's important to empower frontline leaders and workers, public and private, and education and non-education, to have responsibility for making decisions for themselves without being sort of tied up in knots, if you will, with compliance.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks to Hoover and Mackie for having me here. I have one idea in life, which I've parlayed into 7 books so far, which is that only humans make things happen. And whatever and systems are important, and pedagogy and curriculum and all sorts of, all that's important, but the activating force in anything except maybe a automatic check dispersal from Social Security or something are humans, humans who make it happen. And we rebuilt our governing systems, and I'm starting above schools now, after the 1960s, on the idea that public institutions could be run like a software program, and regulation could be like a software program, and all these institutes. So we never such a thing as a 1,000-page rule book before the 1960s. California has 750 pages of rules on sex education that the principals and teachers are supposed to comply with. That's, one of like 100,000 pages of regulations that apply to the schools. And what all that does is it first gradually, but then increasingly crowds out the room for human judgment. And we created, and Miriam Friedman here, who's an expert on special education, so she and I have worked together in the past on this. We've created the system also where if anybody complains or doesn't like what they're doing, that they have a right to have a hearing, and then you're supposed to prove by objective evidence what's right and wrong. Well, that's impossible. The subjective judgments needed to maintain order in a classroom or to do what's right or to balance the interests of one kid against another, those judgments can't be dissected into component parts. They can be judged by other people. You can say, that doesn't strike me as fair or something, but you can't put it through a legal sieve without actually distorting the judgment. So I was asked to write a paper for this conference, which I'm honored to do, and I went back, started reading all the, I'm not an education expert, reading a lot of books and rereading books and such. I called up Rick Hess, who's at AEI, who's an education expert, and I said, I've been reading all this material, and if I were like you and I spent my life working on these issues, I think the thing to do is to commit suicide.
And on that happy note, we'll move immediately to the break.
And so, but because it's, you get this idea of the wheel going round and round and round and round and nothing ever changing. And so I wrote a book basically, I could turn it into a book. I wrote a paper on basically saying there's no such thing, asserting as a matter of fact that you can't have a good school that doesn't have a good culture. And you can't have a good culture unless the educators feel they own their choices. The teacher has to feel that she is in control of the classroom. Doesn't mean she's not subject to pedagogy and stuff. And the principal can't inspire mutual trust among the teachers and everyone else if he or she doesn't have authority to maintain standards and values. They have to own it. They have to come to school and own it. And I assert this not as an argument, but as microeconomic truth. I'm trained as an economist and did economics work before I became a lawyer. I just think it's true. And that has implications for the organization of schools, which leads to the flipping of the...
Yeah, and you mentioned one thing, we can come back to this later too, but that those decisions and those actions that are taken by an empowered educator, principal, or teacher, or what have you, can be judged or second-guessed. Any sort of sense for how that kind of process can work in a way that doesn't mean that everything you do is constantly under a microscope?
Yes, I mean, the way any good school works, the way any good organization works, is that people have values. There's an iterative process where people kind of work their way out or work their way in, and such. The principal either inspires trust by the fairness and the quality of the judgments the principal makes, or doesn't. And the job of the people above the principal, the superintendent or the whoever, is to judge, how good a job they're doing. I mean, the proof's in the pudding here. But it always involves choices that are inherently subjective, that other people have to accept or not, in the hierarchy or in the community, parents, et cetera. It's very human.
But I guess what you're leaning towards is that, essentially judge my work by the outcome that I produce, right? As opposed to, second guess me for how I got there.
As we learned from No Child Left Behind, focusing too much on the outcome can lead to all kinds of other distortions, right? So there is a kind of there are these really complex trade-offs between, and I agree that learning is the most important thing, and you can in fact sort of judge that, and we should talk about, kind of creating a better mechanism for moving forward and comparing how that works. But fundamentally, within an organization, the person or the people in charge have to be able to make those judgments. If you don't trust the principal to be fair, I just had this discussion with Randy Weingarten. She said, oh, we need to have due process to protect against people all these principals who abuse the teachers. I said, all the principals who abuse the teachers? She said, yes, we have to do that. I said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we have a parent-teacher committee that has authority to veto any termination decision? Just have a check. They know who the good teachers are and who aren't, and let them do that. She said, oh no, that wouldn't be good enough. But of course, it is good enough, right? So you can put a check or balance on any decision that you think is important, but you can't get rid of the fact that the principal's job is to judge, in part, of his job is to, how the teachers are doing.
So Jeremy, you're living this in Liberty and have helped design and create a system that has distinctive schools in them, that has authorities that are devolved down to the school level and maybe even beyond. I wonder if you could talk a little bit both about sort of what the snapshot is of Liberty Public Schools, but also how you've gone about applying these sort of principles of autonomy and empowerment of educators in the real world.
No, that's great. I'd rather just sit and listen to Phil, honestly, but great to be part of the conversation. And I go back to grad school and a Scrabble word that I was introduced to, and that's this notion of the principle of subsidiarity, right? And it's that idea that decision-making needs to sit and live where decisions have the greatest impact. And so when we think about autonomy, we could also insert the word agency, whether it's for our learners or whether it's for educators, administrators at the building level. I think that's the sweet spot, right, to your point earlier. And so our journey in Liberty Public Schools really started before my arrival. I've been there now over a decade, which is a long run for a superintendent. But I think the value in that has resulted in being able to work alongside our Board of Education and our entire community toward a lot of these aims. And so rewind with me for a second. When I entered into Liberty Public Schools coming from a rural district into a suburban district, there was a higher level of professionalism, in part, but then also a little bit different expectation. And that's not to negate my experience in my rural community, because I had been there for many, many years in Southwest Missouri, just to acknowledge that there was a significant difference. And so as a leader, as leaders come and go in and out of systems, rural, suburban, urban, into charter space, just the acknowledgement that leadership needs to look different. And growing up, I had a lot of questions, and I thought I would enter into Liberty Public Schools with one simple question. And that question was, what does it mean to be learner-centered? And that's come up this week, right? In terms of, well, I thought we've always been learner-centered. What are you talking about? And to look at it from a lifelong educator and moving from, the idea of aiming to the middle, you're going to lose some, you're going to get some, you're going to move on to the next unit, you're going to move on to the next grade level, you're going to move on to the next year, and that's how the system works. What we're talking about in terms of shifting toward being student-centered or learner-centered is really the foundational piece to flipping the system. And so we've been on this trajectory over the course of a 10-year period to not only answer that question, but as was alluded to earlier this morning, how can we make ourselves a learning system, right? And that's not a new concept. In education, it started several years ago out of Adlai Stevenson High School with this notion of learning communities, right? But it was relegated to the building level. And so we brought that notion all the way up to our Board of Education, where we begin our study sessions with our own professional learning as a Board of Education. We've done a variety of book studies. We've done a variety of site visits. Some districts don't want their Board of Education members walking into their schools. Some districts want everything running through the superintendent of schools. That's not how we do things. We want our board to be informed because they represent our community, they represent our parents and our families, and a variety of industries and sectors. And so by chiseling away at all of this question around what does it mean to be learner-centered, we started identifying key ideas as far as, values or, priorities, aspirations, all the while effectuating our strategic plan that I had inherited. That started to shift. as we started thinking about, putting those pieces together and creating new school models like a choice school, an elementary school that we had just opened the first year that I arrived, that was choice-based within our existing public school setting. Eventually, we've added a couple of micro schools along the way. We've led our community in conversations around portraits of a graduate and what that looks like by engaging our students, our parents, our educators, our business leaders across the area around what are those knowledge areas or skills and dispositions that we need to identify that we want our kids to obtain while they're in school, but that are also portable into college or career or the workforce. But at the same time, how do we reskill adults toward understanding those skills and dispositions and how they fit within content areas and grade levels? We've taken that a step further, and we've identified learner progressions that then are in support of those portrait of a graduate areas in terms of what does it look like for early childhood, what does it look like for elementary, what does it look like for middle school and on into high school. All the while recognizing the reason why we're able to do some of this work is because of our unique context. In Liberty Public Schools, we're not the same as downtown Kansas City and the circumstances that they faced, and I acknowledge that. But at the same time, I want those students to have the same opportunities that we might have in our school district and our community. So the last thing I would say, Jim, to that piece, as we think about flipping the system, while you're able to do it in some systems and some districts, how might we position ourselves to help one another? And that's what we've really taken on in our district in terms of being positioned for purpose and sharing and learning and growing one from another. Earlier it was mentioned this notion of, keep me accountable for my outcomes, don't worry about how I got there. I want to know how you got there, as do all of our area districts as we work to move our district forward, our region forward, as well as our state.
So one of the things that sort of jumps out from that description is the depth and persistence of engagement with the key stakeholders on this journey that you've been part of. And I think, Phil, you've actually written about this too, about actually getting people in a room to try to solve a problem together is the way you develop trust, it's the way you come to resolution of problems that may seem insoluble when, for example, a superintendent, and I've seen this certainly in a variety of places, but it's also true about political leaders, make a declaration, we're going to do this. And you're all going to get on board, or they're in a sales mode as opposed to a problem-solving mode. So, A, is that a fair description of what you went through and how you got to this point? And B, to what extent is that, I think it's replicable, but how do you get people to sort of understand that that's the kind of work they need to do in order to get to the point you've gotten to?
Kenny Rogers' lyrics comes to mind, know when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em, right? Where there are times where you can be a little bit more forthright in terms of those declarations that need to occur, that need to happen. Other times when you have to bring people along with you. And if you've ever spent any time in Missouri, the Show Me State, more often than not, you need to work together to bring people along with you. And so there are a lot of examples of instances where perhaps it's planting seeds as a leader, or exposing people to ideas or concepts, or intentionally bringing in a specific book to learn about examples across the country, or becoming members in the League of Innovative Schools to learn from other districts across our nation. In other instances, the ideas actually come from outside of your leadership and partnering with other industry and other sectors. And there are some great examples of successes that we've had in partnering with other sectors to create opportunities for kids, real-world learning experiences. There are some other examples where that was just a complete flop from that standpoint. I think knowing your context and knowing how far you can get, how quickly, allows for some longevity, but it also hopefully creates that staying power of concepts and innovation that outlasts the leader. That's really the true sign of a learning community.
And Phil, maybe from other sectors or other experiences that you've had, to what extent have you seen the power of that sort of collaborative problem solving, and to the last point, the extent to which it makes whatever gets put into place sustainable over time?
Well, it sounds like at Liberty you have a fair amount of innovation and self-questioning. You're starting new micro schools. You have a lot of things going on there. And so the general point I'd make is that authority has a gravitational force. If people think that that the people running the school can actually make changes and make a difference, then they will come closer not only with their own ideas, but to avoid the lousy ideas of their neighbor, because they may be influenced. So it draws people together the same way litigants, when they're on the courthouse steps, all of a sudden start talking because a decision might be coming down, right? And so the idea, the flipping the system idea, I think is powerful as a community dynamic, not only because it's empowering. If someone has the power to make a decision, then your ideas can make a difference, right? Whether you're the teacher or a member or a parent or community, right? So if the principal has no authority, makes it, who cares? So I think the idea of empowerment of the superintendent, the principal, everybody is incredibly and potentially engaging of the community, and then similarly engaging of parents, who are probably, according to some people, the most important teachers, in getting them involved in the education and the progress of their students and such. So just reason one for flipping the system is to give people the motivation and the opportunity to actually become part of an active, breathing, organic thing called their school system, and their school. And just to jump to other extremes, we're in a period in this country where the ground is shaking, right? We've just elected Donald Trump again. We have the Doge thing going. Everybody, 2/3 of America thinks government needs major overhaul, all this kind of stuff. There are no coherent visions about how to do any of that. Musk and those guys are into cutting at what government does, but they're not actually have any ideas of how to make things work better. So I think there's actually a huge opportunity, if all this could be crystallized into a new and more radical vision, that restoring community control, not of everything, but of the operation of the schools, is maybe in conjunction with some other things that we'll talk about, some of which will be quite controversial, which we'll talk about, can really engage the public imagination and get us past what's been a kind of a steady loop of education reforms that don't do too much.
I guess, again, the thing I'm taking away from this discussion is one way of looking at sort of autonomy or empowering educators, if you will, is, hands off, go do whatever you want to do, every man for himself. But what you're talking about, and what both of you, I think, are describing, is creating space for collaborative work to move communities, schools, or local school systems along together, and presumably in a way that's driving continuous improvement and better outcomes. But is not just put the superintendent in charge or put the principal in charge and let him tell everybody what to do. That empowerment has much more to do with that collaboration and that team building. And in some ways, this gets to what Andrew Luck was talking about earlier in his football analogy, and the way in which football players are empowered is that they're a deeply ingrained part of a team.
Yeah, and I think I go back to that notion of our collective learning, right? And so thinking about leadership differently from just hey, here's the list of compliance pieces that principals or district directors need to be thinking about when you gather together for a meeting. We don't do that. Instead, we talk about leadership development, and we talk about, for example, what I'm learning, right, and what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing. So takeaways from the Hoover Institution Summit will be on my radar for next week when I gather my leadership team together. But then when we talked yesterday about flipping the system, if this is brand new to you and you're reading the document for the first time as far as the report, you may come away with this picture of a complete automatic inversion. Where I think we landed yesterday is, yeah, that's in part the end goal or perhaps the aspired vision, but perhaps it includes some guardrails along the way, right? Some parameters. And I think that's our approach in our district, as far as idea sharing and thinking about doing things differently, whether it's project-based learning or mastery-based learning or Project Lead the Way and how that's integrated into our science curriculum, providing those guardrails and then tasking our leaders and even down to our teachers, how does this show up in your classrooms or in your schools, allowing them to wrestle with it and come back kind of a show and tell as it relates to it, because more often than not, they can tether to a lot of these concepts or ideas that may be deemed as innovation and that they actually show up in their schools. When we started our conversation around our portrait of a graduate and those skills and dispositions, initially it was, oh, here we go, more on the plate, right? We've heard that phrase before. Well, in reality, once they started unpacking it, it's like, oh yeah, we do this, we talk about empathy, we talk about critical thinking, we teach our kids that as early childhood, and those conversations then allow us to coalesce around those commonalities or those themes that we share one with another across our schools or classrooms that then just continues to move us forward. It's really organic in its inception.
So the idea of guardrails, I think, is an important one that we ought to dig a little deeper on. One sort of very specific part of that is there's currently, a set of rules and regulations and mandates and what have you that govern public education. And they sort of establish guardrails that are very sort of tight. In your experience, and Phil, if you've got any observations on this as well, what would be the big, top 3 things that you would want to remove from that book of regulations in order to provide more space for actual decision making at the local or school level?
Top 3?
Top 3.
My former commissioner of education is in the room in Missouri, and she and I have had a long relationship working together on some of this as it relates to how do we move things forward in Missouri. We talked a little bit earlier about funding and what that looks like and its variations across the country. That continues to be a challenge that in Missouri we can't necessarily undo because no one really has the history or the understanding on how to approach that. So that's probably an important piece.
And is that more like restrictions on how funds can be spent as opposed to just general revenue?
It's not as much that as it is by zip code. We're still very much obviously property tax driven, and the result of that obviously is the haves and have-nots. And so we're open for the conversation, but I don't know that anyone is eager to really take that on. More recently, the conversations that we've had, and really this is item 2 and 3, would relate to accountability and assessment. And that we're still a fairly traditional state in how we view assessment and approach that, fairly traditional as it relates to accountability, albeit we've been working on the conversations with various task force and groups and committees going on 16 years now. And so we step in and out of these conversations, but really have seen more momentum in these last couple of years, and working with our State Board of Education over the last 2 years have taken 40 school districts into innovation zone status to be able to design new assessment and accountability structures. Of course, then the federal implications of how do we pursue those waivers and so forth. What I have found is that oftentimes you look at policies or statutes or legislative provisions that you may be seeking waivers from, and lo and behold, they're connected to these pieces over here. So what you were asking for actually isn't permissible because it's required over here. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so we're in the throes of that, of living into currently 2 accountability report cards, one from the state, one that's from these innovation zones, at the same time designing a new assessment system while beholden to the previous assessment system. And so this conversation is really being led from the field in collaboration with our State Department of Education, with hopefully more to come. So
the premise behind the council's recommendations are that there is some kind of assessment and accountability system in order that's fair and valid and reliable.
Yep.
All of those are like heavily freighted words that mean something certainly to statisticians and psychometricians. But is it your expectation or hope that it's possible to actually develop a fair, valid, reliable assessment and accountability system that is actually sort of has high standards, if you will, and is meaningful and isn't just a watering down or a papering over of?
And that's a non-negotiable for these districts that are part of the innovation zone. And if anything, the work is actually more rigorous. In that we're talking about competency-based learning, we're talking about through-year assessment, we're talking about both status and growth, through year, across years, all of those pieces, working closely with several psychometricians in partnership with our state Department of Education to ensure that what we're thinking about designing, passes muster, so to speak. And so I think all of those pieces coupled with, and we've not talked about this too much, relevant, engaging, meaningful experiences. And that you can have the best standards in the world, but if kids aren't engaged and they don't see the relevance in those standards or the instruction that's occurring, then they're probably going to nod off, right? And so how can we maintain high expectations in both spaces from a curricular, from an assessment standpoint, instructional standpoint, but also incorporate those experiential or real-world learning experiences so that every kid as they graduate high school walks across the stage with not only a diploma in hand, but what we're calling a +1 experience. That might be an internship, might be a client-connected project, an industry-recognized credential, apprenticeship, significant dual credit attainment while in college or an early college experience.
And Phil, you've given this some thought. We've been talking about this a little bit. What's your sort of perspective on how we should approach this idea of maintaining the accountability and empowerment of the folks on the local level, but at the same time having a meaningful accountability system?
Well, first, accountability is vital in all organizations and societies. People, even informally, are accountable to each other for their civility and fairness and everything else. So, and accountability is essential in an institution, is essential to mutual trust. As I mentioned, people have to believe that everybody else is held to the same standards. And that so you want to come to work and feel pride in the school you work at, is because everybody's pulling their weight. And there's so many surveys of schools where teachers have gotten discouraged because there is, where performance doesn't matter, right? So we haven't talked about the unions yet. We'll talk about that presumably in a second, if no one has a gun here. And so there's been a lot of attention for our entire lifetimes on trying to make things better. And the lawyers who are charged with trying to make things better invariably write more rules and procedures and forms to fill out and assessments. That's just how they do their job. That's what they do, right? No one that I can think of, except by starting new schools or charter schools really, has actually said, well, why don't we actually have a spring cleaning? Why don't we have an audit and figure out what we're trying to accomplish and take the body of these rules. I mean, we're talking about shelves and shelves, volumes of forms and rules and such, and make it so that they become practical for the educators who are expected to comply with them and to do the assessments or whatever. So having guidelines for assessments is a perfectly good idea. Having 16-page guidelines for each teacher is required by the state of Nevada, which Rick Hess has written about, which takes literally weeks of professional time each year just to fill out the assessments, is not a practical way of doing it. You can evaluate teachers without having all these boxes to be filled out as if it's somehow a computer program. It's not, it's a judgment. And so I think there needs to be a kind of almost an audit of how much space is left over. What are our public, what do we need as guardrails, as legal guardrails? And can they be done by principles instead of detailed rules that can be evaluated? Because many of them can be. They don't have to be specific rules that say exactly how to do this and that. They can be general principles. So that itself is a really radical idea. Let's create, if you will, a new constitution for schools that includes, whatever assessments, whatever we think is necessary, but also honors the fact that humans only have so much time, and their main job is to focus on the students.
So one of the things that we talked about a little earlier offline was instead of relying at least solely on assessments, tests of student knowledge, and data collection and and filing reports
Right.
and that sort of thing. That's something that's more akin to like the UK inspectorate system where
Right.
people, let's call them experts, I know maybe that's a loaded word, but come in and go into classrooms, interview people, and produce some kind of report about what's going on.
Right, really important. So I know this is controversial about whether it should be state level or any level or national level, and I know there's a lot of controversy over what ought to be valued. How much do you value, educational achievement, and test scores, and how much do you value other things? And I understand those are all complex issues, and I'm not, I don't have an opinion on what the best balance is. But having a centralized authority that comes in without any action forcing powers to evaluate all the schools in this country by the same set of standards would be useful even if you disagree with the standards. Because at least it's a frame of reference, which then school districts or states or others could respond to or critique or whatever, but at least you're all on the same page. And now, as we were discussing, when No Child Left Behind came, everybody, states adopted different standards, then they devalued the standards, and then, it was just all over the place. They didn't mean anything. So I'm not a metrics person, generally, but I do believe that organizations, particularly complex organizations with complex products, education, with very different inputs, many different children with very different aptitudes and background, you need a frame of reference. And if I were setting up the radical agenda, which would include much more local autonomy, clear-cutting most of the bureaucracy and replacing it with clearer standards and principles on things that are important, one of the things I would do is have a centralized mechanism for assessing children, so at least we can compare them.
Yep. Shifting gears a little bit. Empowering people is one thing. Having those people be kind of ready and able to take advantage of that empowerment is another. And so I wonder, from both of your perspectives, and maybe starting with you, Jeremy, what does it take, and I think you've already touched on some of this really, but what does it take to build the capacity of your team, of your school leaders, of your educators in order to be able to take advantage of the responsibilities that they've been given and the authorities that they have to make decisions?
Yeah, it's a little bit of if I only knew then what I know now, right? And what I've learned over my maturing over the course of now 28 years in the profession. And that's what kind of strikes me from the report in terms of thinking through what does a fully flipped system look like today, and trying to get people equipped in terms of developing them professionally, if it's a classroom teacher or a leader, shifting some of that authority down to the classroom level that currently we may buffer them from to some extent, some of the pieces, the things they don't want, right? And how do you get there? And so I think it is a complete shift in leadership development, coupled with the rate of change. We've talked about that some, particularly as it relates to artificial intelligence, but also add to that the wealth of information and knowledge that's at your fingertips, right? So as an educator with all this autonomy, I'm in a position of having to pick and choose what I'm going to integrate, what I'm going to apply, how I'm going to approach things. I appreciate the inclusion of knowledge bases and instructional, like stockpiles where I can go and I can get a lot of this information. We have that now through What Works Clearinghouse. We have it through other AIMS, other entities, teachers sharing information one with another. But you have to think about the leadership piece and the professional development piece as well, knowing that it is continuous. As we've heard from other sectors, it's always sharpening the profession, sharpening kind of your skill set, and always learning and always growing. And so then what are those right things that we want to try to integrate? And I think that's where the value of a state education agency or an LEA comes into place, and kind of steering that vision or casting that vision in part that then results in some of those guardrails.
Right. Let me just confirm. I think the value of coaches, we're talking the football player here earlier. The value of coaches is unbelievable. I mean, getting people who can observe what you're doing and say, maybe you should try this, or somebody else did that. We have a daughter who's a teacher, who now is a teacher of teachers. She actually just has a book coming out with Scholastic on the words that teachers use and this sort of choice of words and stuff. There's so much. Teaching is so complex, and it's so hard, and it takes such a high emotional, IQ, to be a good teacher. And a principal is hard in different ways. And so having coaches, having the ability to do that, which, by the way, the unions don't, they're another reason to, we're going to get to this.
I think we're going to get to it right now.
Yeah.
Since you've opened the next 3 times, and I haven't walked through.
Yeah, exactly. It's all your fault. So in any event, but I think the role of coaches is really undervalued. And if you look at the resources that the schools use for this and that was what the budgets were used for, oh my God. If you had more room for coaches and helpers, and at good charter schools, if there are particular problems, they have people, a third teacher will come in and help manage the thing. It's just, it's such a complex profession that you're honoring the autonomy of the people by more nuanced, sort of evaluations of what they're doing and improving them.
And by this related to the role of the principal, and some lessons I think from the charter school experience is that if you want the principal to be the instructional leader, you have to free that person from a lot of other responsibilities. And so the organizational structure, even within schools, needs to be differentiated in order to make it possible for people to do their best work and to do what they're good at.
Can I mention something to kind of steal from the hospitality sector? As you're stating that, the role of the principal instructional manager versus, kind of the day-to-day management. There's a book entitled Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara, if you've read that. And it speaks specifically about kind of the corporate aspect of a restaurant, right, or the kitchen side of the restaurant, as compared to the other side of the wall, and that being the service space, the front of the restaurant. And the value in knowing both spaces and the interplay between the two. I think that's what I wonder about. If I get to this space in which autonomy is provided, do I solely focus on one side as compared to having a holistic leader that truly understands both the management front and the instructional side from that standpoint? I think you can have both. You don't have to pick one or the other, but that becomes part of the challenge in resetting what leadership looks like and what those supports look like, whether it's coaches or mentors, whatever that might serve as far as students in the classroom.
So collective bargaining. So first, Liberty Public Schools is not subject to collective bargaining, so he has no reason to complain about anything, apparently. It's all his fault, personally, if anything goes wrong. But this idea of leadership teams, of educators and staff playing untraditional roles, working together as a team in a collaborative way, is not necessarily well aligned to typical contracts, collective or otherwise. Where people are trying to stay very narrowly in their lane and work in this specific way at a specific time and place, and that's what they do. So in some places where there's no collective bargaining, this may be easier to overcome, although I think the culture of schools and staffing is similar in a lot of places, even if there's no collective bargaining agreement. But how do we overcome that one? How do we,
Right.
I mean, empowerment zones has been mentioned a couple of times, and those typically happen with some agreement from a union to waive certain requirements. Right. So in theory, it's possible, but it's still on a small scale. How do we approach this?
Well, particularly in the big states and the big cities, the blue states, California, Illinois, New York, we're really dominated by public unions and politically and otherwise. So I identify 2 villains in the paper I wrote for this conference. One is overbearing red tape from the top that crowds out, educators' ability to actually use their judgment in daily choices, and the other are the union controls. And the union controls are really about control. They're all about restrictions. If it were about fairness, it would fail the test because teachers are polled about whether accountability is fair, and the answer is no, it's not. Because people aren't accountable. So it's corrosive of the culture for the reasons I mentioned. It's not that you have so many bad teachers. I mean, I think what you have are bad cultures, because people know performance doesn't matter. So you have people who feel their job is simply to do what's required, as opposed to do what's inspired. And schools should be about doing what's inspired. So unions are typically not part of the discussion because they're treated as a state of nature. In fact, public employee unions, teachers' unions, got authority beginning only in the late 60s as an accident of the rights revolution without anyone thinking it through. And the result wasn't to eliminate labor strife, but to create labor strife, because now they had a sword to wield against and they started striking to get more and more, and they got more and more, so that schools in many districts are virtually unmanageable. Chicago has 45 schools where not one student is proficient in reading or math, and no one in Chicago has the authority to change how those schools operate. There was an 18-year study in Illinois that found that out of 95,000 teachers, give or take, an average of 2 per year were dismissed for performance. So here you have miserably performing school districts with near zero accountability, because these rights are they treat jobs as a kind of property right. It's not an obligation to do it. I mean, a job's not a property right. A job's a job. I don't know if you've gotten fired before. I have, surprisingly. I mean, who can imagine? And so who? The teachers' union now has about 4.5 million members in this country. Overall, public employees about 7 million. They collect over $5 billion a year in dues, almost all of which is spent for direct or indirect political activity. They don't provide meaningful services with that. It's really about getting people elected or getting people unelected. So Republicans don't want to take them on because they'll put all the money, from the nation into one race to get somebody unelected who's a Republican. So I don't think it has a political solution. I don't think we can fix school cultures until we can make them manageable again. It's not, I'm all for fairness and fair assessment and stuff. And they're not going to give up their power. They're just not. Why would they give up their power? They're not even thinking about giving up their power. So I wrote a book 2 years ago called Not Accountable: Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions, in which I go through the history and all the evidence, including powerful evidence by people at the Hoover Institution, Terry Moe, and more recently Michael Hartney, on the effects of public unions on schools, and the incredibly corrosive effect on the management of schools. And I argue in the book that democracy can't work if the people we elect, who have the constitutional responsibility to run a school system, don't have the authority to do that, and that therefore the public union controls should be unconstitutional. And the book's gotten a lot of attention, like covers of magazines and stuff, and we're in the middle of organizing a constitutional challenges to the unions, and I'm just finishing up a deck for the Department of Justice now for it to bring challenges to the public union controls. And I think it's the only way to win this. I don't think we can do it politically.
So this is a case where lawyers can actually be helpful instead of screw things up a little bit more? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that remains to be seen, but as Tino Cuellar was saying, before lunch, with a fantastic speech, a fantastic human being, there are some places where we just get to the end of a kind of a cul-de-sac and a roadblock, and we can't get past it, and it has to get fixed. And so it doesn't matter. I don't care if you think what I'm saying is right or not. It doesn't matter that you don't think it can happen or whatever. Schools can't get fixed unless you do this. I don't care what you think is feasible, or anybody thinks. I don't care what a court thinks is feasible. We're not going to fix it. Schools have to be manageable to have pride. And so there are lots of other things that need to happen with schools, but we have to do that, and I think the case is compelling. My career was as an appellate lawyer, as it happens, with a bunch of very business cases, prominent cases in the U.S. Supreme Court and others. And every big case I won was won in spite of the leading experts saying, well, that's not the law. You can't do that because there's this other hearing or ruling that said this. To which I responded and said, yes, but this makes no sense. Business can't go forward, on these terms. This creates the wrong incentives. Well, that's true with the unions. Whatever we intended when we gave unions collective bargaining power, and I have a really interesting chapter on what the proponents thought they were doing. If they were alive today, they would say that the unions were unconstitutional.
Well, first I have to ask you what the name of the book is going to be. So what's the name of the book? What's the title?
It's very, very valuable. I don't know if I can reveal the name.
Oh, well, I want to make sure people are signing up for pre-orders on Amazon.
The book is called Not Accountable.
Okay. Jeremy, I won't put you on the spot to respond to that, since that.
No, I do have some thoughts.
All right. Well, remember, we're being recorded.
Understood.
And, you signed a waiver in the back.
Yes, I did.
So, okay.
For all the viewers at
Fire away.
home, right? A few thoughts in terms of our context. We're a meet and confer state in our district, and we have a structure that addresses and deals with a lot of the same quality of work-life issues that actually was birthed out of some conflict in our previous years with the previous leader and some mismanagement and so forth. And I would say that that structure is invaluable for us. And I think the piece that correlates here is just the importance of trust, and we've talked about that, and working engagement, working trust, engaging teachers, teaching them or treating them as professionals,
Right.
extending that autonomy that really is kind of the culture of what we call our team liberty. There are districts to our east and to our west that have formalized, collective bargaining agreements, and at times they do butt heads, but at times there's also dynamic leaders that come in and bring them together through those bargaining agreements, and really at the center of that is the trust that occurs and the trust they're able to build and the relationship building. So it's kind of a unique piece to see it in some districts and not see it in others. But the thing that I would elevate is that I don't ever want to lose that trust and that relationship that we have with both of our teachers' unions as we've designed this system and this team in terms of our local approach.
And I will say that in the empowerment zone example, which I mentioned earlier, there's one in Massachusetts in Springfield, and I think it's one of these things where when the opportunity is presented for the teachers to feel like they're engaged and have some ownership and responsibility, it actually does, create a stronger relationship and dials down some of the tension that would otherwise exist, and they haven't opted out of it yet, which is a reflection of its success. So it's possible, however.
Yeah, and first, I mean,
this is realistic.
Just the starting premise, all schools are different, and Tino was saying this, different communities are different, have different cultures. Culture trumps everything, right? I mean, so you can have a place where there are not many of them, but where there are unions with lots of powers, where the union leaders, for whatever reason, don't exercise them. Mm-hmm. They don't treat how you spend your time as an entitlement. They don't treat sick days as an entitlement for every Friday, that sort of thing. But that is not the status quo in Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, and certainly not Chicago, and other schools. So, but to the point of trust, I mean, teachers in most places should get paid more. They should have more, I think, more responsibility as well as adequate autonomy. They should have, the ability to do a lot more than they can and work longer hours. And teachers work longer hours than they're supposed to, good ones anyway, than they're supposed to. So they need to be honored. And their views ought to be trusted. That's just not the way that's not the way the teachers' union contracts in most jurisdictions are treated. They're treated as a rigidity and an entitlement and a impediment to any effective management and to any accountability.
So let me ask one more question, and then if folks could start to think and then get up to either microphone on either side of the center aisle here. And this question is, I think, different from the others, but I'm curious as to your perspectives on it. So the focus of this conversation up until this point really has been, for lack of a better word, traditional public schools or school districts as systems and school systems. But we've also talked about charter schools as being a good model for what an autonomous and accountable public school might look like. And charter management organizations as systems of autonomous, accountable public schools. So I guess the question is, what role do you think charter schools, and I could broaden this to public and private school choice for that matter, but maybe just to limit it a little bit, what role do you think charter schools play in this overall effort to flip the system? Is it complementary? Is it competitive? Does it help? Does it hurt? Can we do both at the same time, or do we have to choose? Jeremy, why don't you go first?
So in Missouri, it's an interesting context. They're mostly relegated to St. Louis and Kansas City, right? You don't see it outstate. We call it outstate. I think it's complementary in part, so long as you have this loop as it relates to how they were originally intended to function. That being that you have these hubs of innovation that then are able to give back to public settings and public school districts, right? In terms of this feedback loop of practice that then can be incorporated into what I do in my traditional public school setting. I think that was, at least in our context, what it was intended to do. That seldom happens. Which then gets us into this notion of networks that we've talked a little bit about, and the value of networks and bringing districts together to learn one from another, both traditional as well as charters. We are starting to see more of that, which interestingly, to bring in philanthropy, has been facilitated from convenings through the Ewing, Marion Kauffman Foundation, both primarily in the Kansas City side, but they've also done some work throughout both Kansas as well as through Missouri and our state education departments. I say all that to say is that there's an opportunity to learn and grow one from another. And so I don't know that they're, while typically viewed as competing, I do see them as being able to be complementary. And quite frankly, by even saying that, I know there are my peers that would disagree with me. But we've worked enough with various charters within our region toward the same aim of ensuring that kids have exceptional learning experiences.
I guess I'm saying something maybe a little bit different, because most of those networks or those collaborations are around practice of one kind or another, as opposed to models of what the structure and the systems might look like if you truly were trying to empower district schools to be charter-like in terms of their autonomy and accountability.
And we have some of that in play with the inception of our choice school, a decade ago, that's had a pretty good run. Along with our micro schools, we even approached our alternative school a little bit differently. There are some provisions that allow us to do that as a district in terms of chartering our own school models, but you don't see that widespread. You see that in those districts that maybe either have the capacity or have met certain expectations that then gets you into that earned autonomy that we've talked about a little bit earlier.
Phil?
I think the scale of costs and benefits to charter schools is so radically tipped in favor of benefits that it's almost, in terms of providing models for how to better manage schools, providing really quality education to students who are not like all students because they have parents who wanted them to go to a charter school. So they have the advantage of parents who are involved. That's the kind of the one difference, as I understand it, with most charter schools. Oh my God, with the Good Charter School Network, I spent a lot of time in in charter schools in New Jersey and New York and other places. There's so much to learn from the ones that are good, and they need to be accountable, and they're not all good. And 25% of the charter schools that started in New Orleans after Katrina had to get closed down because they weren't any good. So it doesn't, just having a charter school doesn't mean it's going to be good. But boy, you have the opportunity to be good, and it's just, I think it's been a fantastic movement, including by inspiring discussions like this one.
Yep. Okay, let's open it up. Let's start here.
Jim, good to see you again.
Good to
Carol
see you.
Stevens, recovering college president, as Phil now knows. Jeremy, you've almost anticipated and already answered the question, but maybe there's more you might say about the. It seems to me you have in the process of creating a more, let's call it, open district in which you deliver educational services, but you may serve actually as a convener of other organizations whose work is relevant to your own. Is there more you'd like to say about the kind of partnership, I forget how you termed it earlier in your remarks, partnerships or relationships you've developed in support of the work you do, or who have become extensions of your own work?
Yeah, no, we talked in part about being positioned for purpose as far as some of the things that we're learning and able to do that then we think are of value to all kids. I think it starts foundationally there. And so then our board allows me and our leaders to be able to engage at that level, just beyond our walls, right? So then that brings into this conversation, who are our partners? What does our network look like? And the conversation has evolved into our envisioning of a learning ecosystem, right? Where you have partnerships from higher ed, from the business community, from philanthropy, partnering with homeschool families or charter schools, whatever the case may be. And that there's that common element of students, of kids, and service to our community and to our families, right? And so then from there, it's an interesting dynamic in Kansas City where we started with a group of a couple of superintendents having a conversation with the Kauffman Foundation. What might it look like if we had incorporated this real-world learning experience for some pilot districts and their high school kids? And the notion stemmed from, yeah, that sounds great, but why would we stop there? Why wouldn't we take this to the region? And so it mushroomed almost overnight, by the way, during COVID, into a 6-county effort in 2 states, Kansas and Missouri, that incorporates about 30 high schools and 100,000 high school students, aiming toward a goal by 2030 of obtaining a market value asset. 100% of our high school students doing that. That brought us to the table in terms of that convening to be able to have those conversations. A side piece to that was that it also brought higher education. It brought the business community, because we know we can't do that without those partnerships, and that's integral in order to get to that full 100%. Beyond that, we start looking for other opportunities, okay? If we're working over here in real-world learning, how might competency-based learning move forward? How can we influence assessment and accreditation and policy practices within both state houses across both states? And so it's really that notion of better together as compared to keeping to ourselves in isolation in a silo.
Afternoon again. George Pendleton, if I were to ask everyone in this room to finish the statement, if it ain't broke, they would say don't fix it. If I were to say if it's broke, they would say fix it. But I've found very few hands that would admit if it's broke, if it ain't broke, break it and start all over again. So I want an opinion from these fine gentlemen on what I would offer up as a cocktail for what you talk about combating unions, but flipping the system. First cocktail is Newt Gingrich wrote a column in 2008 that was titled, "Let's End Adolescence." We're familiar with the term early childhood education, but are we in a society where we need to be focusing on early adulthood? In every school, we emphasize reading, writing, and arithmetic. I'm very intrigued by this Liberty School network to realize, do you have any way of assessing whether the kids or the teachers are processing what are known as the other 6 R's: risk, rivalry, research, relationships, results, and rewards. I suspect the kids may process that faster than their teachers. Lastly, because this is like a 3-part cocktail, what would be your opinion of amending the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination in employment based on credentials? I'm done.
Who wants to start? Let's start with a legal question first.
Yeah. I'm not going to, I didn't catch the end of it. To amend it to do what?
Amended to
Amend the
prevent
Civil Rights
discrimination
Act
on
of
the basis of
1964 to prohibit discrimination in employment based on credentials. So if I'm...
based on- yeah, okay, based on-
Yeah,
yeah, I
if I
get
don't
it.
have a,
I
I
get
don't
it.
need to get a degree, then...
Right.
Then I can apply.
Right, I've written books about why rights, why kind of absolute rights end up being gamed by people to get things that no one else thinks they deserve. So I'm not in favor of kind of, broad-based rights. But I do think, at least in many jurisdictions, schools are broke. And I do think it requires a new vision. I don't think it requires tinkering, and I think that's the import of the report here by Hoover, is that it's time to rethink it. I'd like to talk about how you articulate what the new vision is and to try to fit it into the current zeitgeist. But I think the idea of local control, the idea of responsibility and accountability, the idea of common standards. I mean, there are a few things that I think will appeal to people. And the idea of getting rid of bureaucracy. I mean, at one level, what's happened in the last 50 years is you have school bureaucrats competing with the unions for who has more control. And the victims of that, it's like puppeteers, are all the educators at the bottom who are subject to all these legal strings and stuff. So it's clearly time for a reboot. And the reboot should incorporate all the learning and all the stuff and best practices and inspire humans to do this profoundly human important thing, which is educate our youth.
And as it relates to that early phrase you opened up with, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think what we see is that we know that there are better ways of doing things. And it would be much easier, quite frankly, to sit back, enjoy our context, our community, suburbia, so to speak, and not do anything differently, because it is a high-performing district. But we recognize that there are better ways of learning and better ways of teaching. And so I think that's what we've taken on, which in and of itself creates challenges against those people that are, satisfied with the status quo. And so then what do we do in order to move that and change minds toward a better way, a different approach? That is equally challenging, right? And so that's the task that we've taken on, and our Board of Education is there, our community is there in terms of looking at how to do things differently. In terms of the 6 R's that you mentioned, in terms of teacher performance or outcomes of students, how do we assess and measure those pieces as well? I think those are some elements that are incorporated into profiles of a graduate in part. They may not be listed just that way, or the profile of an educator. I think there's more and more momentum occurring nationally. Several states that have taken that on in terms of their entire state and what that might look like. The caution is to measure those or assess those and then rank and sort as we've always done, right? And that I think there is value if we're truly talking about student agency and learner agency. It's the onus on the student to not only grow in those skills and mindsets, but the ability to coach them along the way and how they're able to demonstrate those. So the measures may look both qualitative or quantitative, but then culminate in a portfolio or an extended transcript or a learner record, all those pieces we've chatted about, that then makes that much more meaningful because they've engaged in those skills and mindsets with an employer or with a coach, with an area that they're interested in pursuing.
Yes.
Yes, my name is Michael Kirst. I'm a professor emeritus at Stanford, and I've served 15 years on the California State Board of Education, mostly as president of the board. And I would like maybe the moderator to respond to this as well, since you've had a lot of state experience. So I'm trying to, we've thought a long time about how to take away some of the red tape, the state regulations, the state code. California has a very, very large state code, and it is really overwhelming in some ways. So, you know, one of the first things you think of, well, why don't we repeal a lot of the state code? And you start figuring out, my gosh, you'd have to go through these laws, try and go back through the legislature, try and repeal the stuff. So the discussion you mentioned, and it triggered my question, waivers and typically can be done by state boards of education. It was always in our plan to have a lot of waivers, and the locals didn't ask for them. More, and so I think there's a point of stimulating more requests. But my question is, do you think there's a way, and it would make sense, to go through and try and make many of these state laws waiverable if the local districts come to the board and say, we want a waiver from this restriction? That could be analyzed across the code, and you would be able to get a sort of a massive increase in waiver requests. We approved almost all the waiver requests that came to us. And so I think that's a more, the waiver is not a policy instrument we've used enough. And I like the panel's reaction to that.
You know, I'll respond first. I think that's a great point, in part because a lot of the authorities already exist. And that's true at the federal government as well as at a lot of state governments on this point. The report talks about earned autonomy as being one of the features of this new system, new operating system, which is really effectively a kind of a waiver from a variety of other restrictions or mandates that might apply in general. I think it's from a pragmatic point of view, if nothing else, I think you're totally right. The idea of going back through the code and repealing sections is not only a particularly attractive thing to a politician to do, but it's also, you know, deeply time-consuming and may not lead to the result you want. Right. But either exercising the powers that exist or creating some new waiver authorities, you know, given certain conditions. The one thing I will say, and Jeremy, you may take a different view of this, but when in Massachusetts we've asked this question, well, what do you want to waiver from? They say we want to waiver from the testing and accountability provisions, which, you know, the balance here is that you get the waivers in exchange for accountability. And so, you know, while maybe we can peel the onion and find some other things that they would like us to waive, that seems to be the one thing they want to get out of is the accountability for outcomes.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I'm talking with a bunch of people about changing federal procurement guidelines for the Department of Defense, changing civil service rules, others. And what we're talking about is not repealing, but creating a second channel which subject to approval. It's like a waiver thing where you can do things in a much more streamlined way. And then if that's successful over time, the rules become vestigial, and it's just a question of cleaning them up when you go to the legislature. It's not a question of, you know, changing the law, you know, repealing the law. So I think that's exactly the right way of doing it. But you do have to market it to people. You do have to go out to whoever the constituency is, the schools, and say, we're now allowing broad waiver powers. They're easy to get in this respect. They might be really good in these areas, you know, eliminating the burden of filling out forms and, you know, whatever, you know, and kind of in marketing it. But I think it's a great idea.
And just to speak to what Jim shared, in our context in Missouri, as we've approached, you know, 2 years now of districts pursuing innovation zones, it's not necessarily like usurping those requirements around assessments. It's more about doing it differently. And so in our specific asks, we've had about 6 or 7 different waiver statutory provisions that we've asked explicitly be waived, but yet we've come up with an alternative to the requirement. Does that make sense? And so that has been received well by our State Board of Education. The other thing that I would say that really sparked this work for us in our district, in our state these last couple of years, was the initiation, or the catalyst being the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education called for a competency-based learning task force and work group. And that really kind of gave us that additional momentum to begin coalescing and bringing districts and business partners together to then bring recommendations to the state board that then fast forward culminated in the creation of a formalized network in these zones.
Great. Miriam.
Thank you. Thank you for this great discussion. My name is Miriam Friedman. I've worked in special education as an attorney for 100 years. So this is a great title, Flipping the System. I don't know how we flip the system without touching and changing special ed. While the general population of students in public schools has declined in the last few years, special ed keeps growing. We're up to 7.5 million kids. Many of them are there simply because they didn't learn how to read. Just by comparison, the number of children in charter schools, I think, is 3-some million, so less than half. How do you flip the system without stopping the bureaucratic nightmare coming from the federal government and the states on top of the locals who are trying to educate our children? Thank you. Special ed.
As Miriam knows, because I've relied upon her work in part on this, I've written some about special ed. Special is an example of a, quote, right that gives no authority to balance the needs of the other students. So you have these situations where the field trip to go on a hike is canceled because the one child who's disabled can't go on the field trip. It violates their rights. You have a situation where, many situations where the budget is completely skewed towards a few students who cannot reasonably actually profit from all the money that's being spent on their education, but is taken away from the fixed budget of the school. The federal government imposes these entitlements but doesn't really fund them. But it's hard to take things away. As you know, there's a whole constituency with special ed. There's incredible bureaucracy. Special ed teachers spend almost half their time filling out forms with the IEPs and such. I've written about how other countries do special ed. Denmark, for example, they have balancing mechanisms and they have rights to appeal to make sure the children are being treated fairly, but it's against the standard of the greater good. So we're going to take care of special needs children, but not whatever the cost on everyone else. It's a very, I don't know how you fix it politically because of the obvious dynamics of that. But I think in a system, as you point out, when you're flipping the system, you have to have a realistic view of balancing budgets and allocating budgets. And ultimately, I think the solution is to create an authority structure that people can appeal to, that looks at whether kids are being treated, special needs kids are being treated fairly, consistent with the goals of the law, but still leaves room to balance. And the problem with the current system is it doesn't leave room to balance. And it just doesn't, for all the reasons you've written, you can't ultimately get the resources and the time and get rid of the red tape and stuff without also making sense of the special ed system.
And I don't know that I have an answer. Certainly, a couple thoughts that come to mind would be, regardless of the size of your system, you're still obligated to the requirements, right? We know that. And so then, as we've talked a little bit about audits and we've talked about streamlining, I wonder if there's space for that, where that in turn leads to a faster turnaround in terms of services and supports. Maybe, maybe not, but I wonder if there's the ability to streamline processes so that we can get to the needs sooner and faster. I think that's kind of the ideal to work toward.
And delegalize processes. Again, these are value judgments. So you have this whole system of special ed that's designed for people to sue people. Can you prove that this, that's crazy. These are judgments in the public good. I mean, they're not, you can have somebody else overrule it, but they shouldn't be legal trials with lawyers all over the place.
So we're getting close to the end. Let me ask you one more question, which is, I don't want to say it's out of left field, but a little bit different and sort of gets to maybe the zeitgeist we're in and the recommendations that are being made relative to kind of what the trends might be at the moment. So I think it's fair to say that obviously the report is talking about devolving more authority down to the frontline educators and educational leaders. But nationally and in many states, there's a growing tendency towards trying to centralize decision-making around things like curriculum, for example. And that's, we've talked about science of reading, so there are right-to-read laws that are being passed at state levels. There are laws that are being proposed around civics education. There's all kinds of questions around gender identity and a variety of other things, and a whole bunch of issues related to parents' rights. And sort of establishing new or stronger rights for parents to intervene, if you will, in the education of their child. How do all of, I guess I'm trying to get to, the question I'm trying to ask is, are we in a moment that's ripe for this kind of discussion and this kind of proposal? Or is, are we going to have to do something to really change the underlying political dynamic to get people to agree to this direction of reform?
I just want to say one thing from my standpoint as not being an education expert. Lines of authority and checks and balances have to be coherent. You can't have lowest common denominator. You can't have the power of a parent or whatever to pull the rug out from under the organization and the value judgments of the school. You can judge the school and replace the leaders, but you can't actually create a system that pleases everyone. So what's disturbing about a lot of the stuff that's going on, we want to dictate what books are in there and all this kind of stuff, is it's completely muddying the water on any coherence to the structure, and it ultimately will be counterproductive. So parental engagement doesn't mean parental authority. It's just a different, it's a different point. And so one has to be, while you're seeking through the authority, the gravitational force of authority, to bring people in and to argue, it's the authority that has the responsibility of making the decision, not,
Yeah, I totally get it. Of course, the parents have a legal responsibility to send their kid to the school unless they have viable options, which is why we have
fine. Well, they're
right?
stuck, and we're in a democracy, and they ought to be accountable. But you're not. It doesn't always work out the way you want to work out.
I think of community dynamics in part, whether your community is dominated, factional, pluralistic, inert, right? There's some research studies around that and how, as a governing entity, you respond to those community dynamics that then can inform some of those educational decisions, whether it's curricular choices, instructional approaches, insert the autonomy of the teacher and the choice and decision-making that they have, right? So as compared to the support of a system in steering and guiding best practice, the last couple of years we've seen a rise of open educational resources and content curation, right, as compared to just kind of a turnkey textbook approach. And there's value in both, right? But being able to steer and direct in terms of that knowledge base that we spoke about earlier. Conversely, taking those decisions out of the local level and then legislating them over here, that might provide restrictions, which then is counterintuitive to that local community dynamic and what they value or will permit, which gets into politics, right? In terms of the library volumes that sit on one library shelf in this district as compared to the other, a lot of times that varies depending upon the political dynamic of that local community. I say all that to say, engaging families, but yet at the same time being able to protect teachers through their autonomous decision-making or leaders who are trying to navigate the political arena within their communities. and boards of education, so as not to face this constant swinging of that political pendulum that then impacts instructional decision-making.
Yeah, it's tough though, right? I mean, the environment's pretty tough at the moment. And maybe, maybe this is a passing moment in time and things will go back to whatever normal might have been before. But I do think these, one of the challenges of moving forward with some of the ideas in the council report is this moment we're in where there seems to be a politicization at the highest levels of some decisions that have historically or would, under the council's recommendations would be left to the, the local and the school level. Tough. Any concluding remarks from either of you?
I think change is important, and having a vision for change that can actually galvanize attention is really, it's the bringing some coherence to this narrative and this debate is vital at this time. It's vital for the future of our country in a really scary, perilous world, and so I applaud this gathering and the report and its message, which is let's come up with a new vision for how to make things work.
I think perhaps some common ground is this notion of local communities and asking another question as a follow-up, right? If the first one is, what does it mean to be learner-centered? Perhaps another question is, what does it mean to thrive or flourish, right? That word's gotten a lot of attention of late. That then brings us into dialogue and a conversation, because whether it's in our neighborhood, in our school setting, in our church, in the political arena, I think we can all agree that we want our families, we want our children, we ourselves personally and professionally we want to thrive. But what do we do about that? How do we get to that point and have those conversations? And it's multiple conversations and engagements that hopefully, as we bring in research and ideas and visions of the future, you can start to put those pieces together, which again, I think varies from context to context to context.
And on that note, let's join me in thanking Jeremy Tucker and Phil Howard.